everyone, and welcome to the April 2024 800 lecture series. To start off with, I just like to introduce myself first of all. So, hi, I'm Win, and I'm a graduate from last year from Open High School, and I achieved an ATAR of 99.8. So, what's relevant to obviously today, the English language lecture series, uh, is that I achieved a study score of 45 in English language. Very fortunate to do so. I've also received 40 plus across all my other subjects that I did there. And right now, I'm a Deakin Vice Chancellor Scholar. Um, doing the Bachelor of Electrical and Electronics Engineering. So really keen to you know really present my English language knowledge to you today. And yeah, if you had any questions as we go through, just type them in the chat, and the person moderating the chat who's will answer those questions for you. But also, before we begin, I'd also like to introduce 800s and talk to you a little bit about what the services we offer are. So, since 2007, we've been offering heaps of free resources to make sure students like you can thrive in their studies. So, we often offer these free lectures every school holiday since 2015, and the free lectures are in line with 800's mission to help students achieve as much as possible. And we have tons of free resources on our websites to help you. So here's some of the things that we offer. Obviously, there's the free offerings and resources on 800s.com. If you want to look for more info and tips on how to do this, just go into the doc under the resources section of the lecture page, and you can find the resources there. We also have free notes, free videos, free guides from past students, and that it's like a hub, a forum for students to share with one another. We also have a place, and if you have any questions after the lecture, best place to go is the Q&A section, where current and past students can answer your questions also. So it's essentially like a forum chat for VCE students and also just students across Australia. And if you're looking for even more support, more sort of involved support outside of purely free stuff that we do offer, we also offer Tut Smart, which is online tutoring at a low cost. So we offer groups, low cost groups every week where we run classes, but we also offer one-on-one tutoring as well via Tut Smart. And and you can also access online study resources. These are professionally made, like 800s, like actual notebooks, and also practice topic tests via Ed Unlimited. I think it's called 800s Plus now. Yeah, those are some of the resources that we offer outside of the free stuff, which is fantastic. There, if you're looking for something that's more involved or more professionally made or just generally of higher quality, then we also offer that with tutoring as well as study guides, study resources uh, via 800s Plus or TootSmart. Cool. So yeah, welcome everyone to today's English language Unit 3-4 800s April lecture series presented by me, Winbo. I've already introduced myself. And so let's just get right into it. So this will be the overview of what we are covering today in our lecture. Section one will be the big ideas uh, surrounding English language as a subject. So what I like to think of these big ideas as is essentially what do we want to strive or what do we want to aim for and analyze, right? These are like the key contextual concepts that any time that we're analyzing language or we're looking for language, we're talking about language in English language, then we connect those examples or ideas back to these big ideas. So that includes meta language stuff. So like it within recent within recently, like term one, term two, you have looked at formality, so formal and informal language, and also upcom like to do with that, the prestige that formal and informal language holds with one another. So big idea here as a whole just refers to imagine what you're gonna write for an analytical commentary, say. Imagine those are the things that you're going to write in your introduction. So, that includes your functions, your purposes, your context, your audience, stuff like that. Those are the big ideas. There might be acronyms that might have helped you guys write these in the past, such as FARMS, FCRAP. Yeah, there's plenty of acronyms out there, and these essentially are the big ideas. Then moving on a bit later into section two, this is where we get into perhaps some of the content that your schools wouldn't have covered yet. So these would be looking at specific language to, I guess, more about face needs, more about identity, particularly with euphemisms and jargon, like why do people use them? Usually to uphold a certain face or a certain identity, a certain like prestige perhaps. And that is what we'll be talking about later on in section two. Cool. So really tackling the big ideas here. I think the major one that we need to that is when you're reading a text maybe, or when you're just viewing um, language as a whole, is its register, right? Where does it lie on a register spectrum? Where does the text lie? Is it frozen formal, or is it very casual, very informal? Or somewhere in between, something more consultative, something more, uh, slightly formal, slightly informal, somewhat on either side. Yep. And so the important thing to remember about a register is that it's not black and white, that it's a spectrum. So when you're analyzing language, while register does jump at you, right? Generally jumps at you as being like formal and or informal. There's always nuance in there, right? It's never fully formal, if that even exists, or fully informal, if that even exists, right? So there's always a spectrum that you have to consider. And with that, I'd like to um, yeah, also move on to another aspect of the big ideas, that is the situational context. So once again, what we're covering in the big ideas are just like the very base level stuff that you'd be putting on in an intro for in an analytical commentary, or I like to think of it as like what are the things that jumps out at you, like if you were to write a summary of a piece of language, a piece of text, what are the things you're going to talk about? These are the big ideas. You're going to talk about what the register is like. You're going to talk about what the situation context is like. Now, situational context differs from cultural context that we'll get on in a little bit later, but situational context, this involves obviously the mode of the text, right? Yeah, if you're going to summarize a text, it's really important to say whether a text is written, whether it's spoken, or what's the setting of the text. You know, is if it's a spoken speech, is it during a political rally? Is it at a school assembly? Is it a comedy show? Something like that. If it's written, is it an email? Is it a poster? Whatever, right? So that's settings, fields. Fields, it refers to the topic of the text. It's closely related to semantics. What it is that fields is what you are talking about, while semantics are the language relating to that field. So field here, say if it's a political rally, what are they rallying for, right? If it's for more topically, more like recently, maybe protests against certain wars that's going on in the world. That's the field or the topic of the text. And so, yeah, in if you were to imagine this again, I'm gonna go back to this analogy with the big ideas as the introduction of an analytical commentary or an AC, is that when you're writing the intro, you're essentially taking these big ideas of you're writing what the mode is, what the setting is, what the field is, and definitely what the function is. Function is also another separate big idea that is kind of a subset to situational context. Obviously, the function matters to the context, right? That is like how the context is built. And also, this is a new, also, yeah, key term in the new English language study design. So, for this year, 2024, I don't know, not sure until when, but yeah, you guys who are doing year 12 or English language unit 3, 4 are using the new study design, and you have some new key terms such as tenor here. So tenor, I feel, just adds another piece of meta language that you guys should be familiar with. What it essentially is saying is that it is the relationship between the people involved in the discourse. So here, what that means is it's the like if it's a conversation between a student and teacher, the tenor would be the student-teacher relation, right? Essentially, yeah, it's the relationship aspect that didn't have a specific name to it before, but now it's been given a name. So really not a new idea, rather it's just another piece of meta language that you guys should consider um, throughout your writing and throughout analyzing text. Okay, another uh, oops, another big change to the study design this year are the new functions that you will be using. So previously, there were no set lists of functions that you guys had to adhere to. So there were no set lists, but generally people liked to use the function to inform, the function to entertain, function to persuade. Those are the main big three. Everything else is kind of surrounding that, such as like the function to commemorate, right? Or yeah, celebrate, or the phatic function, stuff like that. Yeah, the phatic function exists here in this context, but now the study design has chosen to rely on a framework, uh, sort of like set out by this linguist called Jacobson, and these are called Jacobson's functions. So the six functions that you guys have should have been working with throughout the year to from this at this point would be referential, which is essentially what informing used to be. informing function, right? Referential, it conveys information. So such text includes a lecture, newspaper, and encyclopedia, right? Or there's also an emotive function. This is really referring to expressing feelings, yeah, like using interjections such as if I were to interject and yell yuck uh, when I see something disgusting, that's I'm expressing an emotive function there. Um, yeah, really expressing my emotions, my feelings emotively, right? Um, Another function that's new is called conative. And what conative essentially means is when it's an imperative, when it's directing towards someone. It's engaging the addressee directly, usually via commands. So if someone tells you to sit down, right, that's that's an imperative. That's a command. So that adheres to the conative function in Jacobson's framework. Um, Another framework that's, I guess, taken on a new meaning is also phatic function. Phatic here, outside of purely casual conversation, also means to uphold and uh, like build rapport somewhat. So outside of just like how's the weather, right? Um, or greetings like how are you? Phatically, what it's doing, what the text is doing outside of just saying stuff for the sake of conversing, is that it really ties whoever is. So typically, phatic is seen more so in spoken rather than text. Although with the advent of the internet, obviously texting and SMS messaging, online messaging, that's a new, I guess, genre of text that would see phatic function being used quite regularly. So usually it's in spoken informal conversation, but uh, outside of it just being casual conversation, it can also be thought of as the act of trying to keep or build rapport, maintain relationships uh, between the speakers or the interlocutors in general, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be talking about something mindlessly, such as like a very random casual conversation. It can be very deliberate. A phatic function can be very deliberate in trying to keep or maintain that phatic rapport, right? Uh, a very new function here is also called meta-linguistic function. This is self-explanatory. We're doing it right now. In fact, I think we're really using the referential and the meta-linguistic functions, right? Obviously, meta-linguistic, meta means about itself, and linguistic means about language. So language about language is language talking about itself. So in me talking about what does phatic mean, that's really serving a meta-linguistic function, right? Not necessarily trying to inform about meta language, but also questioning it, just generally discussing language itself. If we were to converse and to quiz one another or ask one another, question one another on meta language, that would serve the meta linguistic function. And finally, in Jacobson's like sort of functions framework is the poetic function. Now, poetic, I think it like sort of creates is taken from a subset of what is the entertaining function. So poetic in this case is more of a formal version of entertaining, and rather like phatic has taken on emphatic and emotive, I guess, has taken on more of the casual nature of what the entertaining function used to be. So poetic in this case really is talking about trying to elicit um, a sort of response, an aesthetic, elicit a message via the art of language. So this, often done through literature, poems, using uh, metalinguistic patterning such as semantic patternings, right? And it essentially brings in an aesthetic dimension to whatever piece of language you're trying to convey. So usually it can be to embellish like a hidden message or using quotations, right? Like very abstract sort of concepts, right? So, uh, famous quotes like "to be or not to be." That's definitely very poetic. A play is poetic. A song can be poetic outside of being emotive. Uh, but yeah, those are the new functions. Uh, yeah, with much use, much practice in analyzing, that is generally you'll be able to generally identify what a text aligns with more, and there doesn't necessarily need to be one function. There could be multiple in a text, right? Maybe a function shifts throughout the text. That is a key component of how language, of how like analyzing in analytical commentary works, right? A major thing that Vika looks for is how engaged you are with the text. So if you're just skim reading text most of the time, and you're maybe just reading the contextual bits that they give at the top, reading some sentences here and there, you can sort of get an idea, very base level idea of what the text is about. But you don't get a sense of how the text shifts and changes um, throughout the piece, right? Throughout the text, right? Usually, a text can have a changing register throughout it or a changing function. Right? Imagine you're on uh, perhaps you're on like a website. You maybe have a poster, right? A poster advertising for something, right? Initially, the big sort of advertising materials is trying to give an emotive response, elicit some emotions to get you really hooked into the advert. But it may be in like very bottom of the advert, you'll see uh, all the terms and conditions, right? And that is really formal, perhaps serving a referential function, right? So even just in a poster, which doesn't necessarily always have a set structure, you can see there is a changing of the big ideas throughout. And the key thing that Vika always suggests the students to do is to engage with the text, and being able to identify shifts like that goes a long way in really boosting your scores, because it really shows the examiners that you've engaged with the text. Okay. Another really big idea, sorry, another really big idea with English language is purposes. So previously these were called social purposes, but they, have relatively remained the same. These are not limited to these, by the way. These are some, like probably most of the social purposes that are listed in the study design, if I hadn't missed any, right? Uh, so outside of these, right, you can obviously you have to refer to the ones listed in the VCA study design. But when you're reading the text and you're really engaging with it, often a third or like a sort of a hidden social purpose or purpose might jump out at you as being really relevant. And VCA does not limit you to only using the social purpose or like purpose to talk about what interlocutors are achieving socially. So yeah, what you can do is not only mention what Vika has sort of given you as a starting point, but building on that, add in your own purpose that you view is relevant to the text and that you can back up with really strong evidence. Cool. Another aspect of the big ideas would be cultural context. Now, cultural context can be kind of difficult to get your head around, right? What is it exactly? Uh, so, what I'd like you to think about is when you're reading a text, what are the attitudes, values, and beliefs that influences it? Like, if you're looking at an election poster, an election flyer, right? Why are they talking about the election? Well, there's a belief of democracy there in Australia, right? Uh, Particularly with last year's referendum for Aboriginal, or sorry, Indigenous voice um, in Parliament, the attitudes surrounding multiculturalism and Indigenous heritage and the history behind that colonial history is really relevant throughout the advertising materials or the informatives that you see everywhere, right? And that those would be what the cultural context underlie in yeah, those would be the underlying cultural context in the text. So this refers to the sort of extra linguistic circumstances that may influence the language that we use, right? And it's based on the understandings and the traditions that shape and reflect our worldview. So it's typically harder to identify because we're so involved in our worldview already. We kind of have to take a zoom out in saying, well, how is this worldview different from other people in the world, and how might that affect our language differently? And that is usually the difficulty in trying to identify cultural context. But the key three sort of things that you can think about is what are the attitudes, the values, and the beliefs surrounding that text, and in order for you to identify the cultural context there within yeah within any text that you're given. Okay, cool. So we've just covered sort of the big ideas, right? What they mean is they're like the um framework, they're like the sort of pillars that we when we're particularly analyzing uh analytical commentary, or even in when you're writing essays, right? Those would be the pillars that we try to connect the language, specific language use that we see to, right? So we see an example of language that's interesting. Well, why is that interesting? It's based on one of the pillars there, or multiple. But the way that we connect an example and really explain that example to connect with those big ideas would be via meta language. So right now, we're gonna speed run through a bunch of meta language that you would have seen up to this point, perhaps. Maybe a review, if you are not, if you don't remember much of it. Maybe maybe some new meta language that you haven't seen before. And if you have any questions, again, type into the Q&A section. People will be there to help you out. So to start off, conversion of word class. So conversion of word class occurs when you change the class of a word, interestingly enough. if you hadn't realized from the name of the piece of meta language. So essentially, this is when a lexeme uh, its semantics shifts, and thus its class shifts, right? So here we have examples such as "Come on, breakfast with me." Breakfast, in the traditional sense, is a noun, right? Have breakfast. Um, breakfast being a noun for a meal in the morning. Um, but here it is used as a verb. Breakfast with me, like imagine substituting that for run, right? Come on, run with me. That's a verb. Or I'm gonna go yard duty it up. So yard duty here is again supposed to be a noun, but it's a verb. Can you bear me? That's also a noun to a verb. Yeah, so generally it's often a noun to a verb. The idea behind this and why it occurs is really saving syllables or effort, right? What other thing can you do with breakfast aside from eating it? So thinking about it that way, why don't we just make breakfast the verb? What else are you going to do with your breakfast? What else are you going to do with your beer? What else are you going to do with the Uber car, right? You're going to, sit in the Uber car. So let's Uber to the city tonight. And that is sort of the logic that occurs in conversion of word class. So typically, conversion of word class are pieces of informal language because it shows that obviously these aren't like very standard the way that they're using the noun as verbs. Um, so uh, not having to adhere to the standard, being more comfortable with linguistic innovations that really emphasizes generally a informal register. So in all of these pieces of meta language I'm going through, I'm gonna be trying to linking it to one of the big ideas, and you can sort of view how okay at any piece with any piece of meta language, there's always a way to connect it to the big pillar somehow, right? And usually that's register, unless there's a very specific example. Um, so yeah, I guess try to take note in really the way of thinking, the way of the mindset surrounding meta language and how you can think about it just based on the big pillars there, right? Okay, moving on, we have active and passive voice. So the two key terms that we're going to look at is the agent a uh, of a sentence and also the patient of the sentence, right? So the agent is the doing, the patient is the noun doing the receiving. So you would have typically heard this as the subject and the object, but subject and object just refer to the position in a sentence. The structure of a sentence in English is always going to be SVO, the subject, verb, object. But sometimes the subject is receiving an action, right? And that is then known as the patient. The patient really thinks about the semantics underlying the syntax the of the sentence, right? So, for example, Penny ate the kebab. That's uh, the subject, which is an agent, ate the kebab as opposed to passive voice. So the kebab was eaten by Penny, and here the subject being the kebab, but is still a patient, has the received action of being eaten by Penny, which is the agent. Cool. Another is another type of passive voice that you we'll often encounter is called agentless passive. So the kebab was eaten. Now, this is if you find it, it depends on the context that you find agentless passives in. But a key like idea of where you might find agentless passives might be to avoid blame. So particularly if you find examples of agentless passives in the realms of politics, the realms of business, economy, stuff like that, um, right? They're avoiding the blame by omitting the agent there. By omitting the agent, well, it is ambiguous, right? Obviously, people can infer sometimes who is doing the action, but it can create ambiguity in terms of the agent that is causing, well, in this case, the kebab was being eaten, but in more serious matters for politics or whatever, then it can, shift the blame or avoid blame for perhaps a political disaster, something along those lines, right? So, yeah, why do people use agentless passive? Hiding the agent. So an example here is several contracts have been terminated. Okay, terminated by who? The employer. But they don't say that. They're trying to avoid the blame of terminating the contracts of their workers. The house is demolished to make way for a bypass. Okay, so they're avoiding blame on the people making the decision to avoid to demolish the home to avoid that blame, right? Uh, yeah. So sometimes the agent is obvious. The sodium carbonate was added to the hydrochloric acid. It doesn't need to be said. It's gonna be a chemist or a student doing chemistry that does this action. Or a Warrego man was arrested for drinking driving. Well, who's arresting in this case? Well, the only people who can are police officers. Uh, yeah, so in that case, the agent being, even though it's passive, doesn't necessarily avoid blame. And yeah, it kind of just saves space. Or here the agent is irrelevant, right? Smoking is prohibited for whom? Well, for everyone who's doing the smoking. So yeah, okay. So jumping on to another aspect of meta language, we have information flow. So these are just key random bits of meta language that people have found difficulties with. Generally, that is why we're covering it. There's no set structure uh, in sort of like, well, what meta language are we covering? It's just what is often highlighted by Vika as needing more focus on, right? And speaking of focus, information flow. So information flow is where we put the grammatical spotlight on a piece of language. So whether we put front focus, meaning like we really highlighting an aspect of a sentence that's not typically in the SVO order, or in such a way, maybe using a parenthetical phrase such as with this medal, right? Australia, it could have easily been said, Australia honors you with this medal. But with this medal has been placed at the front to really provide focus on with this award, with this honorable piece of medallion that we're in like entrusting you with um, due to a honorable act. Then yeah, it brings the front focus. In this case, it sort of emphasizes the impact, or I guess the how honorable this is, right? Like, oh, it's honorable enough for you to receive a medal in this final sentence. Another form of information flow is it collecting. So it's essentially by starting off with it and the form to be with whatever you're trying to focus or you're trying to put emphasis and focus on. So, for example, it was Lily who stayed her home, who stayed in her room for 3 days straight, right? You're really putting the emphasis on who was doing the whatever action. So it was Lily. Um, yeah. Or we're switching it up. It was her room that Lily stayed in for 3 days straight. So we're putting the focus on in her room rather than at someone else's home or something, right? Um, Another example that's not listed here is end focus. Very similar idea to front focus, right? Yeah. So those are some of the pieces of meta language that's often missed by students. Another piece of meta language that's sort of often missed or not explained very well is cohesion versus coherence. So cohesion is how the text is linked, linguistically linked together, right? So this is to do with the semantics behind the text. Then coherence really puts the structure into the text and talks about like the flow of it and what can be achieves understanding. It like achieves understanding from text. Does it make sense? That's coherence. Cohesion is how linked it is, right? Like imagine uh, the text being very coherent, meaning like all very grammatical and such, but there's no cohesion there, meaning there's no linking of ideas, such as like if it's a recipe book, uh, then there should be not only coherence in the structure of it, but also cohesion in the steps in like talking about the ingredients um, and doesn't jump into talking about politics or whatever, right? And that's cohesion. So factors that impact cohesion and the meta language to do with that include lexical choice. Obviously, like if you're doing a cookbook, you're not going to be talking about politics, right? Because that's not within the synonymy, antonymy, or hyponymy and collocation of the text. Um, Cohesion can also be enhanced via references and deictics. So referencing means like when you reference a part of a text to a previous part, such as um, Tom went to the shop. He bought an apple, right? Then that is referring to a piece of text that occurred before. That's categoric referencing there, and the he there is referencing Tom. That yeah, that was referenced before. That is referencing to something that occurred before. Deictics is similar. It's a type of reference, but it refers to uh, referencing in sort of the physical and the contextual um, like space. So imagine a funeral, or doesn't have to be funeral, any speech in particular. If you're introducing someone, you may go like, "Here with us today," right? Where's here? Well, on the stage or at the ceremony. That's deictics. Information flow is part of cohesion. We've talked about that. Uh, Repetition, ellipsis, and substitution really tries to um, like sort of keep the topic, maintain the topic of the text, right? So substitution and repetition particularly um, it maintains the topic of the text, while ellipses here sort of removes unnecessary repetition while also maintaining the topic, not like veering away from it too much. Conjunctions, adverbials also a way that you can sort of enhance cohesion. Yeah. Cohesion, on the other hand, is talking about sort of a structure, right? So this includes formatting. I don't know, it's not listed there. Obviously, formatting is almost always the most important bit. Then there's also logical ordering, right? Is there like an ordering of information for it to make sense? Or is there background knowledge that needs to interpret the text? Like, uh, hail the size of a golf ball fell on Ballarat yesterday. Well, you would need to know what a golf ball, the size of it is, right? Then conventions, consistency, yep, obviously aids coherence. Thinking about if it's a letter, then it's got to have a dear someone, a sign off, right? A structure to it, essentially. The structure and conventions consistency really ties within one another, and cohesion is part of coherence. So we have an example here between cohesion and coherence. So this text may be coherent, but not cohesive. So all these sentences are coherent in that they make sense individually. Can you get the phone? I'm about to go out. I'm talking to Sally. You owe me a coat. But there's no like linking between ideas between A and B talking here. It doesn't really make sense. So uh, cohesion, really ties the text, like the ideas within the text together. And while this text, I don't know what's saying, I'll be honest. Apparently it's cohesive, but it certainly lacks coherence, right? You don't know what it's saying at all. There's barely any structure to the writing. The words aren't always on the uh, grid lines. Yeah, the lines there. So yeah, that's cohesion, coherence. So now we move on to formal language. So typically in the first term, schools would have gone through content for informal language for the most part. Some schools switch it up. They do formal first, informal later. Whatever the reasoning is, um, here we're going to cover a little bit about formal language. And so it may serve as a little bit of a revision, or may serve as new information that you haven't been exposed to. And either way, just exposure to it is always better. Um, so, in talking about formal language, it's really important to consider different subsystems and what is going on, like to that, like how is formal language affecting those subsystems individually. So in the case of phonetics, there might be different ways of speaking, right? Such as example is, I guess it's not particularly relevant in terms of phonetics and phonology, because how you speak may not always convey how formal your language is. Rather, it may convey a prestige level, right? Such as if you say butter instead of butter, right? Less consonant flapping there. Um, then you may be viewed as higher class because of the more received pronunciation that we'll get on to a little bit later. Um, but particularly with formal language, though, there would be less non-standard phonetics. So things such as assimilation, connected speech processes, insertion, uh, those aspects of phonology would be less common. Then morphology and lexicology, this is very relevant to formal language. Obviously, if it's formal, people will be using jargon, right? Particularly if it's in sort of if the context or the field is in a highly specific area or discipline. Elevated lexis just means, well, lexis means words, elevated means like higher class, I guess, or like higher up. So words that seem high class, right? um, yeah, less common words, you know. Uh, like imagine you read a text and you see incredulous or presumptive, right? That's elevated lexis. Is there a need? Think of it as, is there a need to say in such fancy language? Um, well, if there's not, outside of just wanting to be more formal, then it's elevated lexis. Cool. Syntax. So thinking about formal language, it usually just means you're paying more attention to how you're speaking. So with syntax, there will be very clear structure to the your sentences. Often the constructions will be more complex or even compound is quite formal. Uh, so yeah, and then generally people speak in active voice. So if you see a passive voice or normalization, that highlights, it could be formal language or parallelism. That's a type of syntactic patterning where imagine it's like essentially a repetition of the same pieces of constructions to really emphasize something. So imagine this is America. This is the greatest country. This is freedom, right? Imagines, I don't know, someone running for the presidency in America saying that. Why are they using this is, this is, this is? That's parallelism. That's really trying to drive in whatever those ideas there, and you're drawing comparisons and parallels between America, greatest countries on greatest country on earth. I don't. That's an example. That's not my opinion. And also, freedom, liberty, happiness. You know, those ideals with what America is. For discourse, with formal language, maybe very clear turn taking, being very polite. So using discourse particles such as excuse me, sorry, politeness features you'll see often. And also adjacency pairs such as questions and answers, responses, greetings, salutations, such and such. And for semantics, you'll often see more euphemisms to avoid taboo. People really are more considerate with their language in terms of, well, what is this um, gonna elicit in terms of emotions in the other person? And that is formal language there. So yeah, a lot of this is from a unit 3. So with phonology, oh yeah, so now we sort of talk about informal language. Yeah, like different features of that. So you'll often see connected speech processes, elision, insertion, assimilation, vowel reduction. You may even hear a lot of non-standard pronunciation, and perhaps while it's not formal or informal, but the prestige associated with the accents, right? You're gonna like you're at a job interview, you're gonna generally try to go for a more cultivated accent. Everyone's language changes, right? In terms of morphology, lexicology, you may be more linguistically innovative using blends, acronyms, initialisms in a more informal setting. Um, yep, so, and neologisms. Uh, with syntax, there may be a lot more ellipsis. For example, if you're asking for the time, um, or yeah, like the current time, or like if there's you're meeting up for rendezvousing for something, then a very simple time, uh, maybe as a text message would essentially convey the same understanding is what is the time, or what's the time that we got to be there, something like that, just time, right? Or conjunctions is also a way that it's common in informal language, such as so I went to the store and I did this and I did this and I did this. There's not a lot of thought in trying to uh, create a like a flow, um, not considerate with how the sentence are structured, rather just listing of ideas, right? Cool. In terms of discourse, when it's informal, there's going to be overlapping speech. You're talking with a group of mates. They're going to be yelling over one another, interrupting one another, right? Uh, yep. And there's also non-fluency features, right? Like it's going to be less prepared. So there's going to be ums, ahs, pauses, repetitions. Yep. And yeah, and with this goes, you're gonna also perhaps hear maybe like laughter in this in a more informal setting compared to a formal setting. With semantics, you're gonna hear wordplay like puns, jokes, and even dysphemicisms, taboo terms, such as swear words, um, and slurs. Yeah, which is part of informal language. That is part of what people use to speak when it's in a place where they feel comfortable, not as charged, less they don't have to adhere to the standard essentially, right? Now we're gonna cover a little bit about the formal language social purposes. So these are the main ones that you'll be looking at. Think about the face needs, you're being considerate of the other person in your language. Think of the social distance, authority. Perhaps you're speaking to a teacher. Depending on your relationship with them and the authority they have on you, your language changes compared to speaking to a friend. Think about expertise. So you're trying to, when you're presenting, right, such as I am here, I'm trying to establish expertise by using all the meta language in the world that I have access to, right? Um, Also, in formal language, being considerate of the audience you're presenting to, oh, I've just repeated. Oh, yeah, yeah, never mind. You're gonna try to promote social harmony, right? Or if, in some cases, disrupt very deliberately, but usually that's not formal, um, and negotiate social taboos. So imagine you're giving a speech, perhaps you're uh, like a very important convention in Australian discourse is the acknowledgement to country, right? Why do we do that? That maintains social harmony. It's a convention. It's thinking about social taboos and it's thinking about face needs of uh, like First Nations people and the land on which we live and stay and exist on. It's their land and we're just essentially they've welcomed us to it, or we can acknowledge that this is their land, right? Wherever you're coming from. Cool. And there's also going to be clarifying, manipulating, obfuscating, and rapport as part of formal social purposes. I'm sure you're familiar with these for the most part. So throughout uh, our lecture so far, I know I'm going at a very fast pace, but you see me sort of jumping around ideas a lot. You know, I've been talking about prestige here, like at the start of the lecture here, and definitely later on in the lecture slides, and that really is important, right? Because what it shows you is that every pillar of English language is connected to one another. So when you're analyzing language, you may find that you can connect it to one pillar, but really sit for a moment at every example and think about it a little bit deeper. What something further can you connect it to? what's another pillar you can connect it to, or maybe perhaps ask how or why they have used this piece of language as opposed to just how. Say like say imagine you have an example of elevated Lexis, right? And you link that to, oh, it's formal language. How? Because it's thinking about uh because they're using, very considered, like, fancy language to describe the situation, whatever, right? So that's formal register. But then I want you, at every example you do, to kind of pause and think, well, why have they done that, right? Perhaps there's an expectation for them to use this flashy language. But why? Usually it's about prestige or about the values or about their attitudes and beliefs that the person holds, the expectations that surrounds them. And that's typically what prestige is about, right? And so at every stage of your analytical commentary, or even, yeah, essays, any time you're analyzing language, in English language, I want you to pause at every example and think about why, how, really think about one extra pillar that you can connect what of example that you're talking about to. Not only extra pillar, think about why have they genuinely done that. And that really shows the examiners that you're connecting with the text. You're not analyzing surface level, right? Anyone can say elevated Lexis is a piece of formal language. Can everyone say that, well, why have they used a piece of elevated Lexis? No. And that really puts you ahead of whoever is ahead of other people also the doing the exam, right? Or maybe doing the SAC if you're competing with other students in your year level. Cool. So think about prestige. It's about how the language is perceived, right? Um, so there's going to be quotes here. You can read them. They're not too important. It really just shows examples of how the language you speak, every form of it, all the words you use, the way you sound, right? Even your name matters, and in what prestige it plays, the discrimination that exists, or the beliefs and values that are held in society. That is what prestige relates to. So in their home, often expected to use, maybe not, yeah, expected to use non-standard form of English for, say, for example, like an indigenous person using Aboriginal English, because, well, thinking outside of just prestige in terms of like public's prestige, right? It's called overt and covert. We'll get to that. There's also covert prestige, right? Covert prestige meaning street cred in this case, right? It's like when you're in a small group, you're not going to be using the language of a politician. You're going to be using the slangs that your group, abides by, because it's what gains you prestige. It presents you as being part of the social group. But when you're speaking to like more polished, to like the public, you're gonna try to be more polished and use more standard language, right? Because that's overt prestige. Language in whatever forms always carries prestige in whatever manner. So, prestige definition wise, so we've sort of been talking about it. Haven't really talked about definition. It's really not important the definition rather than the feel for it, right? So prestige, however, just means respect and admiration and values, beliefs attached to the language, right? It then acknowledges the power that the piece of language carries within a group. It's really important within a group, right? Because prestige carries differently to different groups, different settings. So within a group, that power of language is different. Overt prestige comes with the using the standard variety of standard English, using very grammatically correct, abiding by, very formal type language. Well, while covert prestige comes with sort of flouting the standard. You can, yeah, think of it as street cred. So overt prestige uh, typically like allows you to present yourself in a position of authority or expertise. Uh, yep. So if it considered a doctor speaking to a patient, they're gonna use overt prestige, right? A doctor wouldn't go, "Yo, dog, sounds that I've got some hella bad news for you. You got the Rona, fam." Okay. Yeah. Um, and again, we associate standard English with prestige, and it comes with authority. So covert prestige can also be think about it. Think of outside street cred being cool, right? It forms a part of group identity. And politicians often try to implement this. It often fails to. Um, in using covert prestige to come out as, you know, more down to earth and being cool, right? Like, for example, Obama using Yao, and that was like a revolutionary like tactic then, right? It could be genuine, it could be a tactic, but it seems genuine, and that's what carried him to gain that street cred. And also Trump recently just using a lot of profanity and swearing in his political campaign, trying to conveying convey that image of the everyday man, right? So Bob Hawke, I'm guessing a linguist, or yeah, says that yeah, he has three accents. So they'd be talking to people on the shop floor, they'd be talking at the union meetings, and they'll be talking in the house. So that, shop floor probably more informal, in the house probably very formal, right? Union meetings maybe somewhere in between. You're trying to be friendly, but you're also trying to, uphold your prestige there, overt prestige in that regard. Uh, yeah, so Raleigh Sussex, I'm guessing also Raleigh Sussex, I'm guessing also another linguist. Um, a quote from her or him, no idea actually. Um, is that okay, Australians are good. You can like paraphrase all these quotes, by the way. And all these quotes that you've seen here, you can use it in your um, essays, particularly if you found that these people are Australian. Um, so you can use this in your essay. So if you say Australians are good at adapting their accent to the people they're talking to, then you can then write a paragraph about social prestige and how Australian language differs from others in the world based on perhaps giving examples of politicians being quite informal, such as Shorten saying "struth" uh, 20 times, trying to out bloke. So that's another piece of slang, bloke, Australian wise. Really important for essays later to come in the year. So yeah, Kate Burridge and Howie Mance are also sources of like quotes that you should really look at. They're very prominent Australian linguists. Kate Burridge definitely. She's the person who's written your textbooks or a lot of your guys' textbooks. So yeah. Um, yeah, so Australians, polis in this case meaning politicians, use slang to draw fairness and authenticity in public discussions. Now, another side of language that we gotta consider is called taboo. So taboo, often words, essentially naughty words, right? So we often think about social taboos. Uh, for example, poo is usually social taboo. Um, and there's like sort of many, like if you say if I'm going to the bathroom, that's a way to avoid that. That's a euphemism for taking a poo, right? That's weird to say. It feels weird to say because it's socially, it's a taboo in what is society, right? There's taboos surrounding everything from cannibalism to obviously reproduction, women's like reproductive systems, all the sorts, right? Race, definitely race. There's a lot of taboos surrounding that, right? So something to consider is that a couple of years back, Australia ran a tourism ad saying, "Where the bloody hell are you?" And this ad was banned in Britain, interestingly enough, for the use of bloody. So the film Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, filmed at kids and using the word bloody didn't seem appropriate, right? But why is bloody like judged to be acceptable in the second situation where a kid uses it rather than in a tourism ad, right? Well, perhaps it's linked at like the audience that's going to see it. Who's going to see the tourism ad for Britain, right? Like it's going to be people from outside Britain. Well, people watching uh, Harry Potter and Philosopher's Stone in Britain are fine with the word bloody. Okay, so there's ways of negotiating social taboo. Obviously, using non-discriminatory language, language that doesn't have bias, such as people of color, over like specifying their race, or using political correctness. Uh, like instead of saying "Hey guys," which generally refers to men, typically maybe use language. Well, I'm not saying to or against. Political correctness would generally say um, use language that incorporates all, right? And then euphemisms, you may use the restroom instead of the toilet, right? Because toilet has connotation with, um, yeah, I don't know. It's just negatively connotated because of the social taboo surrounding that. Example, last year that I actually used in my essays fairly often is the change by ANSCO, which is like the Australian New Zealand like Committee for Occupation something something. Um, so they changed the title of childcare worker to early childhood educator. And the effect that this has is really elevating that lexis, right? And it's euphemistic, right? Well, education is like a euphemistic term over just childcare worker, and it avoids the negative connotations surrounding child minding. Yeah, so taboo, it often feels comfortable, feels like a punch in the stomach, so that's why uh, people really of try to avoid it for the most part, but it can also be challenged perhaps. There'll be texts often where someone trying to crack down on the taboo really uses it a lot and tries to break it down and tries to emphasize that it's not that big of an issue, you know. So it's your job as English language students to when you see examples, really identify what are the taboos, why are they challenging it, what are why do the taboos exist, and that's to do with the social context of the um, of the like the social context. Sorry, not social, cultural context. Uh, of the taboo. Like, why are there taboos surrounding race? Because well, Australia is a very multicultural um, country. It also has colonial history, right? Perhaps that's why race is really important in taboo terms. Yeah, I'm just gonna speed through a bunch of these slides because generally it's just talking about taboos and euphemisms. So we've talked about it briefly. Euphemisms just means a way of speaking to avoid offense or obscure the truth, right? Uh, so for example, death. People usually don't say someone died. Maybe they would say passed away, and it's really a way to sugarcoat. Um, Yet euphemisms such as assisted dying and dying with dignity are held as acts of compassion over talking about like, oh, it's assisted suicide, all right? And this is talking about euthanasia in this case, right? Cool. More meta language jargon. So jargon are technical specialized terms in a uh, in a specific discipline or field, right? So these are some jargon to do with gaming, and these are its definitions. Cheese clip, damage boost. I'm not gonna go through them. You kind of get the idea. You've heard jargon even before English language before, even before taking English language, I presume. So, what is the purpose of jargon? That's what's really important here. It's really allow you for you to communicate effectively, right? Imagine you're a group of doctors and you're talking about like you know the anatomy of the human body. Are you gonna be uh, talking in terms of like, oh, this muscle just above the knee to the left, below the pelvis? Or I guess that's a piece of jargon there, right? That's not exact. So using the jargonistic phrase and terms for the muscle names, right? Or like position wise, that's communicating effectively. It allows speakers to communicate complex ideas very um, concisely, succinctly. It also marks a social boundary, right? It really defines, clearly distincts between those who understands the jargon and those who don't. Uh, but it can also be used to obfuscate, and that's kind of like the backside of it, right? Um, Obfuscating in this case meaning like if a politician uses jargon to like sort of avoid terms that have often negative connotation. Uh, for example, I forgot who it was, but last year, a prominent figure in Parliament used the term economization, right? What does that mean? That means spending less. So they're telling Australians to economize, meaning to spend less to save up. Well, people don't want to hear that they're trying to spend to spend less. Obviously, it, well, it was like obviously a big thing last year, this year, cost of living, right? So they don't want to hear a politician, I forget who it was exactly, um, just telling them to spend less. That's obvious to them. So instead, mm, he uses the jargon of economize to sort of hide that true meaning, right? And obfuscate, which means to confuse or hide the truth, or manipulate even. So there's often um, some difficulties in distincting between what is a slang, what's a piece of jargon versus what's a colloquial language, right? A jargon, you can think of it as language specialized for a subgroup. So even if it's within gaming and it's kind of slangy, like uh, like uh, uh, I can't not at the top of my head at the moment, but you might consider it as gaming slang. Well, it's technically jargon because it's in a specialized subgroup. Those who specialize in it. Colloquial language are words that are generally used unknown across um, the population, but are generally informal, right? Things like good day and mate, that's colloquial. Well, slang is, and colloquials tends to stick around for longer. So less sort of, I guess, what's the term? Uh, well, it sticks around for longer. And what I mean by that is, think about TikTok slang, right? TikTok slang such as, uh, what's like a piece of like, Riz is recent, but it's still relevant. Mm, that has been slang. Like imagine, just think like 3, 4 years back with slang, TikTok slang, right? Then that's not really used now, right? And the reasoning for that is that slang don't stick around for as long as colloquial language. While it is known in a usually smaller subgroup, but it can also be as big as the subgroup of TikTok users. Uh, okay. Yeah, yeah, that's just more examples of jargon. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about face needs, and uh, yeah, okay, we could put time, I think. So what's face needs exactly? Oops. Okay, face is something that is emotionally, that is like connected to your emotion, to your perception, and it can be lost, maintained, or enhanced, right? It's to talk about a person's sort of feelings or vulnerability, uh, right? And so while it's kind of difficult to define, it's generally thinking about a person's desire, right? And so in terms of positive face needs, there's going to be a desire to be liked, going to be desire to fit in, be accepted in a group. And think about negative face needs, there's going to be a desire for a person in discourse to try to be independent and not be hassled, right? Not to have their rights imposed on, to have agency. So these are not the opposite of one another, despite it being called positive, negative face needs. So positive, you can think of it like outwardly face, while negative is inwardly face. Positively, they don't want to be, harassed, obviously. Um, they don't want to be, they want to come off as being liked. Well, inwardly, um, they don't want to be fussed by other people, right? And that, yeah, they're not the opposite of one another. So here we've got examples of some face-threatening acts. So obviously for face, like maintaining or achieving face needs, obviously like compliments would go a long way. Politeness strategies goes a long way towards negative face needs. I think those you should be familiar with. Usually it's harder to find face-threatening acts. And so for face-threatening acts, these include, so for positive phrase needs such as criticisms or insults, or a lack of empathy, right? That's a threat to whether the desire for you to feel liked or feel like you're part of a group. And then for negative face needs, there's threats would include being given commands or inflicting social obligation or convention upon you. So things like guests are expected to bring a gift for the baby. That's gonna be like, okay, well, uh, perhaps you're gonna do it anyways, right? But did you really have to remind me, right? It's imposing on your negative face needs, inwardly desire to not be threatened by anyone else, right? Uh, and that's a really important aspect of social purpose, right? Or purpose in your case, is that when someone's trying to do something socially, right, interact socially, they have to manage and consider the face, positive face and negative face of the interlocutors involved and the audience, whether they are really inflicting on someone's positive or negative face needs may harm their, image or their expectations, their prestige. So yeah, finally we we kind of wrapped up on meta language. Really rushed through that. I know it's a lot. Again, if you had any questions, type it into the discussion space for the lecture. Uh, and those generally were just the main pieces of meta language that people typically find difficult with, in terms of like VCA responses. Obviously, that's not every single piece of meta language on earth, not in English language for that matter. But yeah, so with the last bits of, I guess, the uh, yeah, with the last bits of, I guess, the lecture, let's take a step back and think about analytical commentaries, right? How are we going to write them? So, analytical commentary, understanding the task. Um, for your exams, it will be marked out of, so the rubric is out of 15, but then it's weighed out of 30, and then there's going to be two assessors that marks it. So in your final result that you may get, that you get, it'll be two exact assessors marking it. Their combined scores will be out of 60 for this part of the analytical commentary. And but on an exam paper, it'll be like 15 marks for short answer questions, 30 marks for an AC, and 30 marks for essay. So it represents a significant chunk, right? It represents 2/5 of your time. Oh, sorry, of your marks in an exam, and it should represent a significant chunk in your exam as well. Typically, you'd spend 40 to 50 minutes writing the analytical commentary. It's usually a little bit shorter than your essay, so you can afford, spend more time on the essay, spend about 10, maximum 20 minutes on your short answers, right? And that adds up to 2 hours of writing. And to really achieve that, it's super time intensive, the exam. To really achieve that, you have to be super considerate of how you use your reading time. So, how do we use the reading time? For reading time, it's really important for you to follow typically like a framework, right? Think about the big ideas. What can you gather out of those big ideas? And this is thinking about, if you have acronyms, that's great, such as FARBS or FCRAP. Think about contextual factors, think about the purpose and the register of the text. Uh, so in terms of contextual factors, we talked about at the start, what's the setting, what's the mode, what's the functions, what's the audience, the tenors, the the demography, the dem yeah, like what are the like demographic features, like the age, gender, occupation, that type of thing, the speakers, the relationships, so that's the tenor in the field of the conversation, the topic. That's what you are trying to gain when you're reading for analytical commentary in your reading time. Um, yeah, what's more important is that while you're trying to identify these features, it's important for you to use the information that you're given without having to waste time. So for AC text, you're very common that you'll be given a piece of context at the top. That gives you, all the information that you're gonna need to really understand what's going on in the text. And if you don't, then the context didn't do a good job, or your, I guess, presumed social knowledge is not up to par. Um, so yeah, so that piece of context there is where you're gonna get a lot of these contextual factors from. You're gonna get the name, you're gonna get maybe if it's like an interview, maybe the studio or the broadcast, right? That's doing the studio. You're gonna get, the relationship of maybe the interviewer, interviewee. What's the role of the interviewer? Or I mean, like, what does the interviewee do? What's their occupation, right? Is it a podcast? What type of interview is it? How formal is it, right? Um, you can get all that information from from the context of the analytical commentary. So save time where you can, because uh, ACs and every aspect of English language is very time intensive, in terms of there's not there not being a lot of time for you to do your SAC or your essays or ACs in your exam, right? And those contextual factors you can identify fairly quickly. What's you gotta identify when you're reading, though, is really the social purpose and the register. So register, you can kind of get an idea from the context, but really you're just from the context you might get whether it's formal or informal. You're not gonna get how formal or informal it is, right? You might know it's a speech, but like maybe a graduation speech, but that could go either way. Someone could be very formal about that or very informal about that. And the social purpose, you're not going to get that from just purely the context either. That's really where your attempts at like analyzing the text is going to go. So what is the social purpose of text? You're going to have to be reading the text, if it's spoken, then think about topic management and think about how the people are talking to one another. That's affecting how they are, socially uh, socially influencing one another. And yeah, and there usually would be a tone, and that is conveyed with the social purpose or maybe the function as well. So, okay. Uh, and with the features that you analyze, um, they're going to have to discuss all the subsystems. There's got to be phonological, phonetic features that you find if it's spoken. If it's written, obviously, you can't. But you have to discuss some morphological examples or lexicology examples in lexicology. You have to find examples in syntax. You have to find an example in discourse. You have to find example in semantics. Uh, so just view an analytical commentary as a checklist, right? Firstly, the biggest tick mark that you have to adhere to is that are the examples relevant? Then after that, you're gonna think about, well, have I discussed the contextual factors, the social purpose and the register, the stylistic and discourse features, right? And then finally, have I talked about all the subsystems, the interesting bits of the subsystems in the text? And really, if you can achieve all of those and your writing is really well, well written and sort of interconnected. All the ideas are well aligned. Your explanation linking between the examples and the uh, big ideas pillars are good, then you're gonna achieve a relatively high mark for an AC. That's all it is to it. Your Aside from the intro, essentially it's going to be a couple of paragraphs for you to be discussing all these different ideas arranged in your own way. There's no set structure to an AC. You don't have to do it subsystem by subsystem. You don't have to do it thematically. For example, you start off by writing about the function, then you write about the social purpose, then you write about the register, something, 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 right? You don't have to do that, but you can. There's plenty. Some teachers uh, even suggest for you to do it chronologically, right? Like, throughout a text, there's going to be different sections to it. Maybe the introduction section is like a greeting, and you may talk about it in terms of like, so in the greeting section, they're being very polite to one another, stuff like that, and then you talk about all the relevant features there. That also works as long as you tick all those check boxes, then everything is fine, right? And finally, do we need a conclusion for an AC? So, no, you don't need a conclusion for an AC. It's a commentary. Think of it like a commentary to a sports game. You're gonna introduce all the players. You're gonna introduce all the context behind it. Maybe where the teams are in the table, the ladder, such and such. The context, their record going into the game. But then during the game, that's the text. You're gonna be talking about the different aspects, right? You may choose to focus on one team for this half and the other team for that half. That's fine. You may choose to focus on as the game goes on, right? I guess commentary isn't the greatest example, like a sport commentary, because it usually is chronological. But that's the idea. You kind of just have to talk about all the important bits as they come, as you see in the game. Imagine it's post commentary instead. It doesn't have to be chronological commentary as live sports usually is. So, yeah, you do a checkbox. You don't really need to do a conclusion. No, it's a bit of waste of time because you're commentating on it. You don't need to summarize it. All your ideas should be conveyed succinctly enough. So in terms of structure, there's two main ways. I mentioned the third way that people do is chronological. It's way less common. These are the two main ways. I personally did the big ideas way, like having a paragraph. So personally, I had register, first paragraph, then purpose as my second, and then my final paragraph is the discourse, like register. And throughout, I connected all those to contextual stuff, to function stuff, whatever your structure is, it doesn't matter. You just have to tick those check boxes, right? And so, yeah, I guess it's kind of advertising for the big ideas. I'm not saying you need to go for it. Do what's familiar to you. But for the big ideas method, it usually allows you to have an overarching theme for each of your paragraph. So I guess it's more consolidated, but subsystem is also great. I know people who have achieved amazing scores using subsystem methods, better than me even. So it's not a hard and fast rule for you to use this big ideas method, right? Whatever you do, you just have to tick those boxes, go into depth with your analysis. And what's really important is outside of your structure is how you talk about those examples. You have to be able to introduce your example with meta language, very like in-depth meta language, by the way, not something as um, you know, as vague as dyslexia. You gotta talk about, well, what class is it? Why is dyslexia important? Maybe it's an element in Lexis, right? Maybe it's a jargon, right? So that's the first bit. You gotta be able to introduce it with meta language. Then you gotta, you know, be able to link that to uh, your your big ideas that's relevant, right? Answer when, what, how, why. Every piece of example, you talk about the context surrounding that, you introduce it, meta language, and you answer the how and why as your explanation, as your um, analysis for it. That is what the crux of an analytical commentary is. You have those examples, you are able to talk about its context, talk about why it matters, talk about and analyze it. Then the way that you order those different examples don't really matter as long as all those examples have ticked all the boxes, right? Generally, there will be a structure to it that you find, okay, along the way. But it doesn't have to be a big idea one, subsystem one. It could be in any way that you want, right? The criteria just talks about, well, have you presented it, uh, you know, cohesively? And cohesively is kind of the main thing that you got to focus on in terms of ordering. Talking about discourse at the start and at the very end may not be a great idea. What if you put them right next to each other? It makes the flow of information, you know, much better and more integrated. So yeah, we have an example here. This is, I'm guessing, a paragraph on discourse features. So here, at the start of each paragraph, you kind of want to introduce the topic of the paragraph, right? This is a big ideas paragraph, a paragraph on discourse. So this topic sentence in this case is just, as a spoken conversation, discourse features are prevalent throughout the text. Very simple. Very simple. You just need a sentence that's not long at all. Maximum 1 to 2 lines, 1.5 lines, right? Um, and then you really just jump straight into your analysis. So overlapping speech, they've mentioned that as a meta language, and then they give the example on line 2 and 3. So every example you do, you gotta give line numbers, obviously, uh, and and they explain the context behind it. So here, C starts to speak over A, presumably because C guesses A will finish the sentence. You don't just say on line 2 and 3 and then put the example. You also talk about the context behind it. Why have there been overlapping speech? Oh, because C started speaking over A because C thought that A had finished the sentence, right? And that's an example there. And how they've linked this to a big idea is that they've linked it to sort of the discourse bit of it. So it shows that it's a spontaneous conversation. Maybe they could have linked it further. Why is it a spontaneous conversation? Maybe it's because it's formal. It's because the context, like the relationship between C and A, are like very, they're friends, so it doesn't really matter, right? And they're meeting up for coffee or something. That's the extra step that you need to go in order to really fully analyze each and every example. Then overlapping speech used in flow management. So here this person has chose to do their introduction of or their examples a little bit differently. Here they've actually chosen to do the analysis before, then provide the example, right? And then do the explanation. So Actually, maybe it's like sort of just introducing the meta language first, and then yeah, so they've introduced the meta language and sort of analyze what it is useful in terms of discourse, right? And then they give the example: A takes the floor. Turn taking is indicated in several ways. For instance, C is initially asked a number of line numbers, encouraging A to take turn. Okay, they didn't really give number of questions. Ask a number of questions. Okay, typically if it says something like that, maybe you just give an example to one, right? Ask a number of questions such as this on this line, right? You don't have to list all of 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 3, and 6, sorry. But yeah, um, so this would be a high scoring response. It's not a perfect response, right? There's certainly definitely ways to improve on it, and that's what I've sort of talked to you about it, right? And my way of doing it is different to yours, but the idea is that you're able to introduce all the contextual bits around it. You're able to analyze it, and you go that little bit further in terms of why does it matter, okay? So, uh, I guess here's some examples of big ideas ones. I'm not a I'm not a huge advocate on trying to get you guys to do one of these three types of ACs, right? Do whatever you want. Certainly, number one is what here this one AC number one. It's probably much similar to what I did, but as you can see, it's not what I did, right? So my way of doing it is going to be different to what ATA notes or previous people who have, done English language have suggested. There's going to be ways that you might do as well. And it's going to be dependent on text, right? Maybe, well, discourse is always important, but maybe you find that the social purpose is not that important for it to have a dedicated paragraph in its own. Then you put in another thing. Maybe it's about register and about the context instead, about the function instead. Maybe you just, maybe, obviously these three decide that discourse isn't a major thing. So they don't talk about it. I think medium in this case means discourse, like the medium of like the text. So that is discourse. But that's the idea. With the big ideas or even the subsystems, you can play around with it dependent on the text. Okay. And also I mentioned this earlier. Using meta language, you have to be precise and you have to be accurate. You have to be very in depth, right? Saying word, saying lexeme doesn't convey much. Saying determiner or saying definite article conveys way more that you understand the text, you understand meta language, you show the examiner. Always think, always think of English language as trying to show the examiners. Don't try to follow, don't try to uh don't try to follow a certain structure because you've been taught to. If it's limiting you, if you find the structure is limiting you because you think you have this idea that can really extend your analysis, extend your essay, then go ahead and do it because you're trying to show the examiner that you know things, right? You're not trying to be like everyone else where they're doing this specific way. You're not an AC, right? It's not like a recipe. There's no recipe for it. You really should, let yourself freestyle and do what you think you are most comfortable with. Though you'll be doing a lot of practice, right? Maybe at the start of the year, you may try to if you're already being involved in the big ideas sort of method. Maybe try these different ways to do the big ideas text, right? And then see how you feel in terms of, well, how easy it is to write about a text for each one of them. Maybe you find one that works for you 90% of the time, but 10% of the time it doesn't work. That's where you drift off, and that's fine. Again, it's doing the checklist, and it's showing the examiner that you know better. Okay. Uh, yeah. So always try to find uh, conflicts and complexities within the text. Dynamic shifts is really important. That's what I talked about earlier in terms of like shifting kind of big ideas, like in a poster, there's going to be formal and informal aspects. There's going to be, changing changing functions throughout, right? So always try to find that because it shows that you're involved with the text. And then build a like word bank. Use language that, you know, doesn't really convey absolutes, but shows that it's scientific, right? You're not saying that this is definitely true, that there is a definite, social purpose to clarify something. You instead say, well, this example of them using a declarative perhaps really aids their clarifying purpose in in conjunction with supporting their role as a teacher, right? So me saying right as a sort of what's it called? I forgot the meta language term for this. Uh, interrogative tag, I think. Um, at the end of sort of every utterance is really just to uh, seek affirmation for like understanding, right? See, and that I'd say that supports that his role as an educator, my role as an educator, because they're seeking whether I'm seeking whether you are understanding the issue. And so it supports that rather than it definitely shows that. You're not definite about anything in the English language. You're never 100%. You try to be 70, 30, 80, 20 most of the time. And that's the idea of English language um, ACs, right? Make sure you're doing inline style of analysis. You're not trying to prove something, you're trying to identify and sort of explain it, link it to the big ideas where you can. Try to capture the flavor of the text. And what this means is you're engaging with the text, you know, thinking back about this, try to find complexities within the text, context and conflicts. Dynamic shifts is really important, right? Maybe there's multiple interlocutors. Do they all have the same social purpose? Do they all carry the same register? Do they all have the same function? Perhaps not. That's part of English language and capturing the flavor of the text, right? Cool. So, tips and advice on how you study. Obviously, any questions, type it in the comment section, right? And revise meta language for ACs definitely. If you found your structure for what you want to do, in terms of subsystems, maybe you want to do the subsystems or the big ideas method, right? Say you want to write a register paragraph, then what you need to do for an AC in particular is if you know that you're going to write about it, think like sort of brainstorm all the meta language that you may find that supports that big idea. Like for a formal register, oh, and it's written, oh, it's gonna be normalizations, passive voice, those things, right? If you're able to sort of mind map it up and yeah, come up with all the meta language that may be relevant to each paragraphs that you tend to write, then like a snap of a finger as you read the text, you notice them immediately and you're able to find examples really quickly, right? And what does that come with? That comes with a lot of practice as well, getting feedback. So really ask your teachers, ask your tutors, uh, yeah, about feedback. Ask them, well, maybe not even the whole text. If you view the whole idea is great, like really identify whether you're struggling with trying to integrate an example and analyzing it, or you're trying to find those big ideas within the text in the first place, right? Yep. Okay. Um, and then I think the rest are like tips for essays that will come generally later on in the year. But yeah, we'll talk a bit about them now. So, oops. For essays, you're expected to find your own examples, your own contemporary evidence that you find within media, within your daily life throughout the year, right? It can be anecdotal evidence, right? And so you gotta create a word bank. Oh, sorry, not word bank. Like usually an evidence bank, right? Um, I'll show you an example of that. Is that an example of that? No. Okay. An evidence bank would involve you to like have your examples and then maybe a column talking about its meta language, maybe a column talking about the big ideas or the analysis it's involved with, right? And yeah, you need examples for um for essays because at the end of the year, come the end of the year for exams, examiners are looking to see whether you've been attentive with English language in society throughout the year, right? They don't want you to come in, you'll be given stimulus materials, but only to use stimulus materials in your writing. That's just the guide, right? You're required to mention one of it, and probably only one. That's all, like, you only want to mention one because most of what we want to mention is to show the examiner that you know things. You know a lot uh, about English language in society, what has occurred in the year, and the context that surrounds that language, that unique piece of language. So, yeah, um, maybe your school hasn't started essays yet, but now is a great time to start looking for examples. So, examples would generally be in 2024, but it technically goes 1 year back from the start of your exam date. So at the very end of 2023 would apply, but generally just look for 2024, right? And a way that you can help find examples is, well, these are like the ideas that you'll have to focus on. But you can also see the type of topics that are generally given. Take a screenshot if you need, this is like a matrix of all the years up to 2021 and the topics that's been asked. And these would be the yeah, keywords when you're looking for examples. Perhaps search these keywords into Google, or maybe the context behind that, right? And also these are some of the examples where you may find your examples, right? Like if you're looking for TeamSpeak, listen to Triple J. Like with very considerate pieces of language, you've got to think about the sources that you may find it in. You're not going to find science jargon in an Albo speech, right? You're going to find it in scientific journals, such and such. So yeah, that's just my general tip so far. Um, Thank you for coming today. Have any questions? I hope that it's been answered in the chat. Um, I wish you luck for the rest of the year. Wish you luck with being able to learn meta language, doing analytical commentaries. That's been a big focus on. We have a big focus on that for this for this like lecture series. I know it's been a little bit messy, um, but yeah, and that's what English language is. It's not almost nothing in English language is that structured, right? Especially ACs. You're just trying to do a check all the tick boxes and show the examiners your very best. So good luck with the rest of the year. Good luck on your SACs. Good luck on your exams. Hope you guys join Too Smart or ATAR Notes in some shape or form, be involved in the community, and thanks for coming.